A sprawling mansion, dim nightlight in the nursery. A billionaire businessman pauses at the doorway and freezes. On the floor, curled protectively around his infant child, lies the family's maid. No bed, no blanket. Just the carpet and the baby breathing softly in her arms. He doesn't say a word, but something inside him changes forever. The maid arrived before dawn. Her footsteps silent on the marble floor as she let herself in with the spare key. The mansion was still wrapped in darkness, the air heavy with the kind of stillness that only comes before a new day begins. She moved quietly, setting her small bag in the corner, tying her apron, and beginning her routine without a sound. She dusted the grand staircase, polished the silver trays in the dining room, and folded the freshly laundered clothes that still smelled faintly of lavender. She moved with precision, as if she had memorized every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the long hallways. But beneath all these duties, there was one task that anchored her entire day, caring for the baby upstairs. She walked to the nursery softly, as though even her footsteps could disturb the child's fragile peace. Inside, the baby was still asleep, one tiny hand clutching the corner of a blanket, breathing evenly. She smiled faintly, adjusting the curtains so the morning light would fall gently across the crib instead of glaring directly. Throughout the day, her world revolved around the child. Feeding times, changing diapers, rocking the baby when small cries broke the silence. She noticed things others might overlook, the way the infant's lip trembled just before a cry, the way the tiny fingers searched for something to hold during sleep. Sometimes, in the middle of the day, the baby would wake from a nightmare, small body, trembling, eyes wide in confusion. She would hum the old lullabies her own grandmother once sang to her, soft melodies from far away, carrying warmth even in their wordless tunes. The music worked like magic. The baby's breathing would slow, the little body relaxing against her arms. The parents, wealthy beyond measure, were rarely at home. Their lives were a blur of meetings, charity luncheons, and evening galas. They would sweep in briefly, perhaps kiss the baby's forehead, then disappear again into the waiting cars. They assumed the maid's work began and ended with duty: feed the child, change the child, keep the child safe. They never asked about her nights, never wondered if she ever slept, never imagined the weight of responsibility she carried hour after hour. Days blurred into nights, weeks into months, until one stormy evening arrived unlike any other. The wind howled through the tall trees that surrounded the mansion, rain slamming against the wide windows. Upstairs in the nursery, the heater made a strange rattling sound before going completely silent. Within minutes, the room grew colder, a thin draft slipping through the old window frames. The baby stirred, uneasy, went to the crib and touched the mattress. It was already cold. Quickly she layered 2 more blankets over the little one, but still the cries came, sharp and urgent. She tried holding the baby and rocking gently, but the shivering wouldn't stop. The storm outside raged on, sound of thunder rumbling deep in the walls. She thought for a moment, then lowered herself onto the floor, away from the crib. She tucked the blankets around the baby and pulled the child close to her chest, her own body acting as a shield against the chill. The baby's tiny face pressed into her shoulder, and slowly the shivering eased. She whispered soft, wordless tunes, the same lullabies that had once comforted her through long, cold nights as a child. She didn't notice when her eyes began. Too close, exhaustion pulling her into a light sleep. The carpet was hard beneath her, but it didn't matter. The baby was warm, safe, and calm. It was then long past midnight that the front door opened downstairs. The billionaire father stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat. He had returned earlier than planned, his last meeting canceled because of the weather. The mansion felt unnaturally still as he climbed the stairs, his polished shoes tapping softly against the steps. He reached the nursery door and, without making a sound, looked inside. What he saw stopped him completely. On the floor, beside the crib, lay the maid, her arm cradling his sleeping child. There was no pillow, no blanket for herself, only her curled form protecting the baby like something precious beyond measure. The child's small hand rested against her collarbone, their breathing perfectly in sync. The faint hum of her lullaby still lingered in the air, mingling with the sound of rain against the glass. He stood there in the doorway for a long moment, his hand on the frame, something unfamiliar tightening in his chest. He didn't call her. Name didn't clear his throat, didn't step forward. He simply watched, the kind of watching that feels like listening. In that quiet moment, the image burned itself into his mind. His child held not by blood, not by family, but by someone who loved them enough to sleep on the floor in the cold without asking for anything in return. He didn't understand yet why the sight struck him so deeply, but he knew one thing. He would never see her the same way again. He barely slept that night, the image replaying in his mind no matter how many times he shifted in bed. His child, small and fragile, tucked in the arms of someone who had no obligation beyond a paycheck, yet holding them as if the baby were her own flesh and blood. The warmth in her posture, the way her body curved protectively, the soft hum in the air, all pressed on him with an ache he could not name. By morning, the feeling had not dulled. As he stepped into the kitchen for coffee, he caught sight of her moving about with quiet efficiency, folding laundry, wiping the counters, feeding the baby, all without a single pause or sign of fatigue. It was as though the night before had never happened. She didn't look at him differently, didn't expect him to bring it up, didn't angle for gratitude or recognition. She simply worked, her attention always drifting back to the child with a softness that was impossible to miss once he was looking for it. He began to see her through a different lens, one that magnified the things he had overlooked for months. The baby's bottle was always warm and ready before the infant cried for it. The nursery, though modest compared to the rest of the mansion, was spotless and smelled faintly of lavender, something he realized was her doing, not the cleaning. Service. In the afternoon, when he lingered in the hallway, pretending to check his phone, he noticed she skipped her own lunch, pushing aside a plate to prepare more formula, ensuring the pantry was stocked with the baby's food before anything else. When rain swept across the city, she arrived with damp hair and shoes, clearly having walked instead of taken a cab. He didn't understand why until he overheard her quietly telling the driver she couldn't afford the fare every day. She was saving money for her younger siblings' school fees. One evening, as he passed by the laundry room, he stopped at the sound of fabric tearing gently. She was mending one of the baby's tiny shirts by hand, her fingers moving quickly with a needle and thread. There was no complaint about the workload, no mention that it would be easier to replace the shirt. Entirely. She handled the small tear as if repairing something precious, something worth keeping whole. It made him think about how easily he and his wife discarded things, clothes, furniture, even people, without a second thought. That night at dinner, he brought her up to his wife. "We don't really know her, do we?" he said, stirring his soup. Without looking up, his wife glanced at him, puzzled. "Know her? She's the maid? She looks after the baby, she cleans, she gets paid. What more is there to know?" He didn't answer right away, watching the flicker of candlelight dance in the silverware. "She does more than that," he said finally. But his wife only shook her head and changed the subject. Her dismissal sat with him long after the meal. Later, in his study, he found himself at the security console, scrolling through saved footage. He told himself he was curious, nothing more. But as the hours passed, curiosity gave way to something heavier. He watched countless moments he had never witnessed in person, her kneeling on the nursery floor, rubbing the baby's back through a bout of hiccups. Her standing at the window, gently bouncing the child while pointing at the falling snow outside. Her leaning over the crib in the early hours of the morning, whispering softly after a nightmare woke the little one. In some clips, she looked tired to the point of collapse, yet her touch was always steady, her voice always calm. He realized these were not the actions of someone just earning a wage. This was devotion. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was constant, and it was real. The realization unsettled him. He had thought love was something you felt naturally for your own child. Yet here was someone unrelated by blood, showing a form of love that seemed deeper than his own hurried goodnight, kisses or quick check-ins before meetings. When he finally turned off the screen. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the security system. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples, feeling a quiet shift in his chest. It wasn't guilt exactly, though there was a trace of that too. It was something more complicated, an awakening of sorts. He saw her differently now, not as staff or help, but as a person who had woven herself into his child's life with invisible threads of care and sacrifice. And without realizing it, she had begun to weave herself into his own conscience as well. The rain had been falling since morning, a steady drumming against the mansion's tall windows. By late afternoon, the clouds had darkened to a heavy slate, and the wind carried a damp chill through the air. The nursery, the maid noticed the baby's skin felt unusually warm during a diaper change. At first, she thought it might be from the thick blanket. But when she pressed her palm gently to the child's forehead, the heat made her heart lurch. She checked again, this time feeling the flushed cheeks and hearing the small, restless whimpers that came between breaths. The baby's eyes looked glassy, and the usual grip of tiny fingers on her sleeve was weak, almost limp. She glanced at the clock. The parents were at a charity gala downtown, surrounded by flashing cameras and polite applause. She reached for her phone and called the father's number. It rang and rang and rang, no answer. She tried again, this time pacing the length of the nursery with the baby in her arms, cries growing softer, more unsettling. Still, there was no answer. Her chest tightened as she realized time was slipping away. She couldn't wait for permission. Without a second thought, she wrapped the baby in a soft blanket, tucking it securely around the tiny body to shield it from the cold. She grabbed her own thin coat from the hook by the door, and in the next moment, she was stepping out into the storm. The rain hit her face in sharp cold bursts, soaking through the coat within minutes. The streets were slick, and the wind fought her every step, but she didn't slow down. She held the baby close, keeping the little face shielded. From the downpour with her own body, her shoes slapped against the pavement as she half ran, half walked, the blanket growing heavier with water, but still clutched tight. By the time she reached the hospital, her hair clung to her face, and her hands were trembling not from the cold, but from the fear gnawing at her stomach. A nurse saw her rush through the automatic doors and immediately waved her over to triage. The moment the thermometer beeped, the nurse's eyes widened. "We need to move now," she said, ushering them down the hall. The doctor arrived quickly, his voice calm but firm. "You brought the baby just in time," he told her as they began treatment. "A few more hours and we could have been looking at serious complications." The words landed like a weight in her chest, but also a strange relief. She had acted quickly enough. She stayed by the hospital bed as the baby's breathing steadied, never letting go of the small hand that seemed to cling to hers, even in sleep. Her clothes were still damp, her own stomach empty since morning, but none of that mattered. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor became a kind of anchor in the quiet room, steady assurance that the child was safe for now. The sound of hurried footsteps broke the calm, followed by the swish of the curtain being pulled back. The billionaire stood there, hair and suit soaked through, rainwater dripping onto the linoleum. His eyes moved from the baby to her, sitting with her shoulders squared, and her gaze fixed on the tiny sleeping face. "Hey." For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just looked, the scene sinking into him in silence. Finally, he stepped closer, his voice lower than she had ever heard it. "Thank you," he said. It wasn't the practiced politeness she had heard before, the automatic courtesy of someone used to service being rendered. This time, the words carried weight, raw and unguarded. She met his gaze briefly, then looked back at the child. "Anyone would have done the same," she replied, her voice steady but quiet. He knew instantly it wasn't true. Not everyone would have run through the rain, carrying nothing but a child and hope. Not everyone would have put themselves second. Without hesitation, in such a moment, he stayed in the room until the baby's fever broke, pacing occasionally, but mostly watching her. She didn't rest, didn't take her eyes off the child except to speak to the nurses. Every movement she made was gentle, deliberate. It struck him that she was doing for his child what he had never done, sitting, waiting, guarding through the uncertainty. When they finally returned home that night, the storm had calmed, leaving the air damp and cool. He walked behind her as she carried the baby up to the nursery, laying the child gently into the crib and smoothing the blanket over the small form. She turned to leave, pausing only to glance back once more at the sleeping figure before slipping. Out of the room, he watched her go, his mind already working, making a quiet promise he would not speak aloud. She had done something for his family that no paycheck could ever measure. One day soon, he would repay her not with mere words, but with something that would change her life forever. Morning sunlight spilled across the marble floors of the mansion, but it was a softer light than usual, carrying with it a quiet sense of change. The days since the hospital visit had passed without incident, yet something unspoken lingered in the air. She continued her duties as she always had: early mornings, careful meals, steady hands with the baby. But now, the father found himself watching more often, not with suspicion, but with a kind of silent gratitude. He noticed how the baby's face lit up when she entered the room, the way the tiny arms reached for her without hesitation. It was a bond built in quiet hours, in moments no one else had seen, and it was unshakable. One afternoon he called her into the study. She arrived with her usual composure, wiping her hands on her apron, unsure why she had been summoned. Gestured for her to sit, but she hesitated at the door until he insisted. On the desk before him were several documents, neatly stacked, along with a small velvet box. She glanced at them, but kept her eyes lowered, waiting for him to speak. "Been with us for some time now," he began, his voice steady, but warmer than she was used to hearing. "You've cared for my child in ways I didn't even realize were needed. And you've done it without ever asking for more, without expecting recognition. But I've seen it now. I've seen what you've done." She shook her head slightly, ready to protest that she was only doing her job, but he lifted a hand to stop her. "No," he said. "This goes far beyond a job. I've come to understand that." He pushed the documents toward her, his eyes never leaving hers. "This is a new arrangement. Your salary will be doubled starting immediately. Will no longer live in the small apartment you've been renting. You'll have a furnished suite here in the house, right down the hall from the nursery, with your own space and privacy." Her mouth opened slightly, as if to refuse, but he continued before she could speak. "I've also taken care of your family's debts. Your siblings' school fees are paid for the next several years. They'll have what they need." For a long moment, she just stared at him, unsure if she had heard correctly. She began to say that she didn't need so much, that she only worked to help her family and keep a roof over their heads. But he leaned forward slightly, his tone soft but resolute. "I know you didn't do this for money. That's exactly why you deserve it." Her hands rested lightly on her lap, her posture still formal, but he saw the faintest shimmer of moisture in her eyes. She nodded once, a small, almost reluctant gesture of acceptance. The velvet box remained untouched on the desk, but he slid it toward her anyway. "For you," he said simply. Inside was a delicate gold bracelet, engraved on the inside with 2 words, "For family." She traced the letters with her fingertips, not trusting herself to speak. In the weeks that followed, the changes took shape quietly. Her new suite was warm and bright, with a view of the garden and a chair by the window where she sometimes sat with the baby during the late afternoon. She no longer arrived at the mansion soaked from the rain. Her room was always waiting. Siblings she had worried over for years sent letters filled with excitement about their new school books and uniforms. Yet despite all this, she carried herself no differently. She still rose early, still handled every task with the same care, still hummed the same soft lullabies in the nursery. One evening, after a long day of meetings, he passed by the nursery and paused at the doorway. Inside, the baby was in the crib, already drifting into sleep, while she sat beside it in the rocking chair. Her voice barely above a whisper as she sang. The light from the small lamp caught in her hair, casting a warm glow that seemed to hold the whole room in its embrace. She noticed him in the doorway and stood to leave, but he stopped her with a quiet voice. "Your family now?" he said. She froze for just a second, her eyes meeting his. It was not the kind of statement that needed discussion or thanks. It was something understood, something that would live between them without being spoken again. She gave a small nod, turned off the lamp, and stepped into the hallway. Ah! The sound of her lullaby fading into the quiet night. Long after she had gone to her room, he remained in the nursery, standing beside the crib. The baby stirred slightly, then settled again. And he realized with sudden clarity that the child was not only healthy and safe, but deeply loved, and that love had been given freely by someone who had started as a stranger. He knew now that no amount of wealth could buy such devotion. It had to be earned, not through contracts or paychecks, but through trust, through time, through the quiet certainty that someone would be there no matter what. From that night on, he carried that certainty with him. Though she never asked for more, he made sure she always had more than she needed. It's not as payment, but as a way of honoring something he could never fully repay the night she chose. The cold floor over her own comfort, simply to keep his child warm.